President Biden said these words a few weeks before Russian leader Vladimir Putin did order the invasion of Ukraine back in February 2022. Since then, the U.S. has sent billions of dollars in military aid to Ukraine, along with other full-throated support to Ukraine's resistance. And U.S. officials have tried to follow through on Biden's promise, imposing sweeping sanctions targeting everything from Russian banking assets to oil revenues to Russian oligarchs.
We're going to seize their yachts, their luxury homes, and other ill-begotten gains.
It was all part of an effort not just to signal the West's disapproval of Russia's aggression, but also to cut off the money spigot making the war possible. But from the beginning, some observers warned that sanctions would be a dull instrument and might not work at all. NPR's national political correspondent Mara Liasson reported that Russia might be prepared to weather economic constraints imposed by the West.
It's unclear how much any of these sanctions will hurt Russia, hurt Putin, hurt his inner circle, because Russia has been stockpiling assets, foreign currency and gold, so that they could weather sanctions, at least for a while.
One big reason that Russia might have been prepared to wait out an economic assault, Vladimir Putin had seen that play before. The U.S. and its allies have tried to use economic warfare to try to shut down previous Russian incursions into Ukrainian territory. Consider this. The United States has sent billions in weapons to Ukraine and, along with its Western allies, has bet heavily on sanctions intended to cripple the Russian war machine.
We are examining a whole series of steps, economic, diplomatic, that will isolate Russia and will have a negative impact on Russia's economy and its status in the world.
Sound familiar? President Obama said this back in 2014 when Russian troops occupied Crimea, a peninsula of Ukraine. Soon after, Vladimir Putin signed a treaty with Crimean officials declaring the region a part of Russia, a move widely condemned by the West as illegal.
In 2014, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and annexation of Crimea really took the Obama administration by surprise. So we were really working from behind.
Edward Fishman was with the U.S. State Department from 2013 to 2017, where he led the State Department's sanctions policy after the Russian invasion of Crimea.
Those sanctions were relatively modest. They cut Russia's largest banks and companies off from debt financing in Western capital markets, but they didn't block their access entirely to the global financial system.
Fishman says that the first major sanctions came 4 months after Russia annexed Crimea. And while those sanctions have remained in force, the U.S. never really increased the pressure until Russia's invasion of Ukraine last year.
And I think as a result, Putin had, almost 8 years to adapt his economy to try to build up sort of armor against another wave of sanctions.
Fishman says through the final 2 years of the Obama administration and through all 4 years of the Trump administration, pressuring Putin was not a priority, and that lack of follow-through likely enabled Putin's latest aggression.
And I think it also weakened the threats that President Biden and other European leaders put on the table in January of 2022. Because if we go back to before the second invasion started, President Biden did, I think, what was a really excellent job at making clear that an invasion of Ukraine would lead to swift and severe consequences for the Russian economy, right? The goal was to deter Putin from invading Ukraine in the first place. But I think that the lesson Putin drew from 2014, 2015, and then certainly through the Trump administration was that the West didn't actually have the will to try to torpedo Russia's economy.
And now, despite tough talk about the latest round of penalties, the U.S. is in a situation that feels like deja vu. Rachel Ziemba is an economic and political risk specialist at the Center for a New American Security. And she says that while targeting the oligarchs' expensive properties made for splashy media coverage, she says it didn't have much impact.
There's a lot of evidence that the oligarchs don't have the degree of sway that the West and others hoped in influencing Putin to pull back.
And when the U.S. seizes a yacht or other luxury property from a Russian billionaire, someone has to foot the bill for holding onto it before it can be sold, a process that can take years of litigation. Stephanie Baker with Bloomberg spoke to NPR about that.
It is U.S. taxpayers that are paying for it, at least until they do sell it and then can recoup the costs. I did a lot of reporting to try to establish what are the real costs of keeping these things in port. Now, in the case of one super yacht, the one that the U.S. government seized and sailed from Fiji to San Diego, I established that the annual cost of keeping that in port are about $10 million a year.
But even apart from all those technical details, Edward Fishman says that the bigger problem has always been rooted in political will. But now the U.S. has found the will to take down the Russian economy.
In 2022, within a week of Putin declaring war on Ukraine, the United States and the G7 imposed full blocking sanctions on the largest banks in Russia, including the Central Bank of Russia. And so what that means is it fully cut them off from the dollar, the euro, and other Western currencies. And that's why we saw things like hundreds of billions of dollars of Russia's foreign exchange reserves frozen. So in terms of the scope of the sanctions, they were much broader than what we did in 2014.
But are these economic sanctions fulfilling one key objective, crippling the Russian war machine on the battlefield? That's coming up.
The sanctions are extraordinarily ambitious in their scope, but relatively modest in their objectives. And what I mean by that is the goal was really just to cause economic and technological attrition in Russia, to weaken Putin's capacity to do harm.
Edward Fishman now works at Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy. He's been following the impact of the latest sanctions closely, so I asked him if Russia has been feeling the effects or not.
A big part of it is that Russia took steps in the period between 2014 and 2022 to diversify away from the dollar. So its foreign exchange reserves, by and large, were not in dollars by the time the conflict started. I think even more importantly, it had moved its domestic payment system onto domestic rails. So even though companies like Visa and MasterCard pulled out of Russia, payments in Russia really never stopped working. So I think a lot of the times when we think of the shock and awe of American financial sanctions, it's really to stop payments from happening. And so that was one of the big things that Russia was insulated from, that shock and awe. There is also, I think, an error of commission that we did, which was we did not initially impose significant sanctions at all on Russia's oil exports. And so even though Russia's economy was cut off from external financing, Russia continued earning billions and billions of dollars every month for the first year of the war, selling oil around the world. And in fact, Western sanctions enabled that. Western sanctions carved out oil transactions. That now is starting to change in the last few months. But unfortunately, it took almost a year before the West really brought the hammer down on Russia's oil sector. And I think that also helped Russia stabilize its economy in the face of these sanctions from early 2022.
The question of the sort of so-called non-aligned nations, I'm thinking about India, I'm thinking about a number of countries in Africa that have traditionally had, cordial, if not warm, relations with Russia dating back, generations, and, Russia's support of their kind of anti-colonial efforts and so forth. Is that making a difference in any way?
Definitely. I mean, if you look at why Russia has been able to sustain the volumes of oil exports that it has, despite losing the European market, which was its biggest market before the war, it's because India now is buying more than 1 million barrels a day of Russian crude oil. So India, China, Turkey, those countries have provided a lifeline to Putin in this war. Whether that lifeline proves decisive, I think, is still yet to be determined. We haven't seen large-scale sanctions evasion through India and China and Turkey. I think, by and large, these countries are just taking advantage of gaps in the sanctions. The thing I'll be watching out for in the coming year is if we do start seeing these sort of relationships with countries like India actually undermining the purpose of the sanctions, how aggressive is the Biden administration going to be in terms of wielding the threat of secondary sanctions, potentially sanctioning Indian or Chinese or Turkish companies that continue to do business with Russia? That was the tool we used against Iran that really devastated the Iranian economy. And my own view is that the Biden administration has to be ready to use this tool if these non-aligned countries are undermining the efficacy of sanctions.
What about the effect on, the average Russian citizen?
Yeah, sure. I think there are kind of two ways to look at this. One is from the prospect of employment. So the combination of financial sanctions and export controls on critical technologies like semiconductors have led to massive declines in Russian manufacturing output. I think probably the best case in point here is the automotive sector in Russia, which indirectly and directly employs more than 3 million people in Russia. It saw production declines of 2/3 in 2022. Auto production in Russia is now at its lowest point since the Soviet times. And so what that means is even though official unemployment rate in Russia is pretty low, I mean, you can't really trust the official statistics anymore, there are millions of Russians who are on extended unpaid leave and furloughs. And so when you factor in these types of hidden unemployment, it's probably the case that more than 10% of Russians are out of work. Even for Russians who have been able to maintain their jobs, on the consumption side, the outlook for the Russian economy has been quite bleak as well. You've seen significant drops in product quality. I think, again, using the auto sector as an example, because of the difficulty in obtaining foreign components, the Russian government has had to alleviate some standards to allow vehicles to be manufactured without airbags and anti-lock brakes, for instance. And they have to pay higher prices for them because inflation has gone up and pushed up the prices of everyday products. So unfortunately, the average Russian is feeling these sanctions, and probably quite a bit more than, the people in the Kremlin.
So let's go back to the original sort of question here. So the purpose of sanctions is there's three purposes, right? Cut off resources to the Kremlin, make it harder for them to kind of wage their war machine, express disapproval, right? Express the disapproval of the international community to this action. And the third is to pressure Putin, I guess, by pressuring the civilian population, right? Hopefully to kind of create enough unhappiness that people would perhaps think about regime change, or at least opposing the regime. On any of those metrics, have the sanctions succeeded?
Yeah, I do think sanctions are degrading Russian capacity, right? I think one of the ironies of Putin's invasion is that Putin thought that invading Ukraine, he was rebuilding the Russian empire and reestablishing Russia as a great power. But because of these sanctions, which have effectively eviscerated the prospect of Russian economic growth for the foreseeable future, sanctions will mark the end of Putin's great power aspirations. That's cold comfort for Ukrainians who are under bombardment. I don't think that the sanctions are having a decisive impact on the battlefield in the here and now. But in terms of Russian power, there's no prospect for Putin to have this type of expansive foreign policy if his government is going to be under these types of sanctions. I think one just interesting data point to point out here is the International Energy Agency, which does some of the most important forecasts of oil and gas around the world, suggests that by 2030, Russia will forgo more than $1 trillion in oil and gas revenues that it would have earned otherwise. And that's just, I honestly can't emphasize enough how important that is, because without oil revenues, Putin's economy, Putin's military-industrial complex just doesn't work. It doesn't make sense. And that's sort of the trajectory Russia's on now from here until 2030.
So I take your point that his sort of dream of this kind of restoration of the glorious Russian Empire, that dream is over, at least for this generation. But the bombardment and the day-to-day hell that Ukrainians are living through goes on. Is there any possibility that we're not talking about the kind of the West and Ukraine's kind of military capabilities right now? We're taking that off the table, but that sanctions will have an effect on the hell that Ukrainians are living through?
So sanctions are making a difference in that they're basically constraining Russia's military capabilities at the same time as Ukraine's are being bolstered. But I would caution that I do not believe sanctions will have a decisive impact on the battlefield. I think when you sort of weigh the factors, the military assistance to Ukraine is by far the most important factor and significantly more important than sanctions in terms of ending the war and helping the Ukrainians win the war. But I think when you zoom out and actually look at the trajectory of Russian power from a 5 to 10 year perspective, that's really when sanctions are going to have the biggest bite. Something I like to say, Michelle, is that sanctions are always more of a marathon than a sprint. And that can be frustrating for those of us who are watching this conflict and hoping that it will end and that Ukrainians can live in peace and enjoy their own country. But
heads of state, diplomats, and security experts from all around the world gathered in a small hotel in Munich, discussing the state of the world at the Munich Security Conference.
There are some notable absentees, but we'll get to those in a second. In attendance, European leaders, a third of the U.S. Senate, the U.S. Secretary of State, Vice President Kamala Harris, and China's top diplomat.
And the latter two addressed the conference this morning. NPR's John Ruwitch has been listening in from Beijing and joins us. John, thanks for being with us.
Happy to do it.
There's lots of talk about whether the U.S. and China could talk after the U.S. shoot down of a Chinese surveillance balloon. The Secretary of State, of course, canceled his trip planned for early February when the balloon was seen in the sky. You have some news to share.
Yeah, a source familiar with the planning here told NPR that Blinken, Secretary of State Blinken, and Wang Yi are going to meet in Munich. You know, there's a ton of acrimony in the relationship, obviously, between China and the U.S., a lot of mistrust. And frankly, there's been a lot of tough talk and accusations. Blinken's trip that was scheduled earlier in the month to Beijing was supposed to be this confidence-building measure, kind of a way to build on momentum after a face-to-face meeting between President Biden and China's Xi Jinping in November. Before the balloon, there was this sense that both sides were at least taking these small steps to put a floor under this deteriorating relationship. You know, it's unclear how much of that can be restored now. This meeting in Munich will probably help a little bit. President Biden said on Thursday he was going to talk with Xi Jinping, but China's foreign ministry did not confirm that. Also, National Security Council spokesman John Kirby, speaking on Friday, said that a formal request for that conversation had not been made to Beijing. So, you know, taking baby steps, right? The big question is, with all this mistrust and tension, what progress can be made?
What did Vice President Harris and others at the conference have to say about the war in Ukraine as it enters its second year?
Yeah. Vice President Harris announced that the U.S. has formally determined that Russia has committed crimes against humanity in Ukraine and promised that they'll be held to account. I believe that's some new terminology there. Those are new words there from her. She said the transatlantic unity and the NATO alliance were stronger than ever, that the international rules-based order was strong and must stay strong, and that Russia had really been weakened by its invasion. And, you know, she reiterated a point that President Biden has made, that the U.S. will support Ukraine for as long as it takes. She did point out that the U.S. was troubled by China's relationship with Moscow and the fact that it had strengthened since the start of the war. And she made a brief but quite clear warning to China not to provide any lethal aid.
China's top foreign policy official, who you mentioned before, Wang Yi, addressed the gathering. What did he have to say?
He did. He had a few things to say. First, he really tried to reassure the audience that China's rise is not a threat, that China growing stronger is a good thing for the world. He said China's development was linked to peace, that it has a track record of maintaining peace, and that wasn't going to change. Secondly, I would say he really took aim at the U.S. in his speech and in some brief Q&A remarks afterwards, painting the United States as a bad actor, trying to thwart China's rise with protectionism. And on the balloon issue, he said that the U.S. response was absurd and hysterical, and that shooting down the Chinese balloon was 100% an abuse of the use of force. And he said it showed that the U.S. is weak, not strong, and suggested that it was done to divert attention away from America's domestic problems.
No invitations to Russia and Iran, right?
Yes, that's correct. It's worth noting that both have attended in the past, obviously Russia since the 1990s. With the one-year anniversary of the Ukraine invasion just around the corner, though, this war is front and center at the conference. And the chair of the Munich Security Conference was very clear about why Russia wasn't invited. He reportedly said that, in effect, they didn't want Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, to try to use the conference as a forum for Russian propaganda. You know, of course, at the same time, Germany's position on Russia has become tougher over the course of the war. Germany's the host of this meeting, and the non-invitation of Russia really reflects its position. In terms of Iran, you know, its officials weren't invited because of the suppression of protests that's been happening there for months.
NPR's John Ruwitch in Beijing. Thanks so much. Latest now in that freight train derailment in Ohio near the Pennsylvania border that caused a massive explosion and fire 2 weeks ago that released clouds of toxic fumes. The state of Ohio will open up a public health clinic in East Palestine Monday to assess residents who have concerns about their health.
Meanwhile, the Biden administration is defending the federal response to the train wreck while also calling for stronger regulations on trains carrying flammable and toxic chemicals. Joining us now to discuss all this is NPR's transportation correspondent, David Shaper. Good morning.
Good morning.
So let's start with the federal response, which state and local political leaders say has been somewhat lacking and slow. Do we know why it's taken so long?
Well, you know, the criticism is coming from both Republicans in the state of Ohio and elsewhere, and even Democrats like Joe Manchin, the senator from West Virginia. And the criticism focuses on why it took almost 2 weeks for any cabinet-level official to come to the site. EPA Administrator Michael Regan did visit the town on Thursday, but no other top administration officials have been there. The response from the White House is that, you know, this is a very active and literally volatile situation, that they were focusing resources on the immediate response, but they say that other top officials will be visiting the site in the coming days and weeks. Ohio Governor Mike DeWine also says he requested disaster assistance for FEMA, which was denied. But the White House says that's because this isn't like a hurricane, tornado, wildfire, or any other kind of natural disaster where there's widespread property damage. This is different. And there's also a party that is responsible, Norfolk Southern Railroad, that has promised cleanup funding and other aid. The White House also says that FEMA has been in regular communication with state and local officials, as have a host of other federal agencies.
Residents have been complaining about symptoms from the smoke and the fumes and the smells they say are still in the air. So what is being done about that?
Yeah, there are symptoms like headaches and dizziness and irritated eyes and throat still being reported, and people there complain they're getting vague and incomplete information about what's in the air and what might be in the soil and water after this catastrophe. So the Biden administration is going to be sending teams of medical personnel and toxicologists from the Department of Health and Human Services and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. They're going to be conducting health assessments of people on the site. The EPA is still on site and has been from almost the very beginning, with state officials conducting testing of the air and the water and even the soil, too, looking for any dangerous levels of toxic chemicals.
So this derailment has raised questions about regulations on shipping volatile and toxic chemicals. The Trump administration actually repealed a measure that required a higher level braking system for trains carrying these substances. What's the latest on that?
Yeah, the braking system we're talking about is called electronically controlled pneumatic brakes. It's known as ECP brakes. And what they would do is they would apply the force of braking simultaneously to all the cars and stop the train much more quickly than the systems that are currently used on freight trains. Well, that rule was repealed by the Trump administration after heavy lobbying from the railroad industry, which said it cost an awful lot of money. And there were some studies that questioned whether it really improved safety all that much. But even if it hadn't been scrapped, it wouldn't have applied to this train in particular, because this train didn't have as many cars as it needed with hazardous materials to fall under that rule anyway. So there is talk, though, of resurrecting this rule or having Congress enact a law that would require these ECB brakes. And even some of the Republicans who had opposed the regulation in the first place are saying now they're coming around.
A lot of people around the country wonder if the U.S. is headed for a recession.
Strong unemployment numbers, yet high interest rates and low spending have economists split. Some forecast a recession and others think we'll be able to achieve what's called a soft landing.
NPR's Stacey Vanek Smith joins us. Stacey, thanks for being with us.
Hi, Scott. I'm so glad to be here.
And what's the difference between recession and soft landing?
I think that's a great question. Essentially, a recession is when the economy is shrinking. It starts producing less stuff, fewer cars, fewer laptops, fewer haircuts. And when that happens, companies, they put the brakes on, they produce less, they get smaller, they tend to lay people off. Mm-hmm. And a soft landing is a little more like the economy just takes its foot off the gas. So companies' growth, the economy's growth, it slows down, but it doesn't start shrinking.
So are we heading into a recession?
The short answer is I don't know. And a lot of economists are very divided about this for good reason, I think, because a lot of the economic data we're getting in, a lot of the big numbers, they're not telling a consistent story.
Well, help us understand what the data shows, because it would seem like if we were headed into a recession, the direction would be clear.
Yes. In past recessions, certainly the ones I've experienced, you feel it. You really feel it. But this is a strange moment. For instance, some of the data that we're getting from the economy is extremely positive. Look at the unemployment rate. Look at jobs. Economist Justin Wolfers at the University of Michigan, he thinks that we are definitely going to have a soft landing.
You're talking to an economist who is going to be happy and tell you that I see really good things and I'm not going to be miserable and I'm not going to be dismal and I want to celebrate the moment.
Wolfers makes the point that jobs are bigger than just a data point. When people have jobs, they're confident, they spend money, they borrow money, they quit, they switch careers, all the things people do when they feel confident. And so jobs are a big deal. And Wolfers also points out that all of this good jobs news is pretty miraculous, considering where our economy was just a few years ago.
March of 2020, unemployment was spiking to rates not seen since the Great Depression. If you had said in 3 short years will yield an unemployment rate that earlier generations of economists had said was impossible, I wouldn't have believed you.
And so Wolfers says as long as unemployment stays low, we are in good shape.
With due regard to the professor, what's the case for a recession?
Well, there's some strong data pointing to a recession, too, honestly. Dana Peterson is chief economist at the Conference Board, an economic think tank. She pointed to all the layoffs we've been seeing in industries like tech. That just tens of thousands of people losing their jobs.
businesses, if they get this whiff of weakness ahead, they're going to pull back.
Peterson says a recent survey of CEOs in the U.S. found that most of them think a recession is coming, or even that we might already be in one. So she thinks we've got a recession on the horizon for sure, but she did say it might be a very mild recession.
Unemployment is so low at the same time. Are experts, I don't know, possibly more optimistic than they are willing to let on officially?
The economists that think we are in a recession or heading for a recession think that maybe unemployment numbers are artificially low. So many companies were saying they couldn't find workers. It was so hard to keep workers. And so they're just possibly more hesitant to let them go than they normally would be. But I think what worries people, including Dana Peterson, is that if companies start to feel maybe like things are changing, that they might decide, let's save some money, let's clear the decks. And that if a lot of companies decide that at once, the unemployment situation in the U.S. could change really fast. Hundreds of thousands of jobs could kind of disappear.
Stacey Vanek Smith, thanks so much.
Thank you, Scott.